Hello, friends, and welcome to the PrepWell podcast. I'm your host, Phil Black. And if you have an 8th, 9th, or 10th grader with big aspirations, like the Ivy League, or military service academies like West Point, ROTC, or athletic scholarships, boom, you've come to the right place. My specialty, my superpower, if you will, is preparing families for these competitive programs. I'll teach you what your child should do, when they should do it, and how you can help. So stick around and prepare to out-prepare. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the PrepWell podcast. Today, I want to give a heads up on what you should do with your PSAT score. Most people are familiar with the PSAT. It stands for the Practice SAT. If you're a sophomore or a junior, you should have just taken this PSAT in October, a couple of weeks ago, I hope, and likely you just got your score back. And you might be wondering now, okay, I see my score. Well, what does it mean? What do I do with this score? So let's break it down. First off, let's start out with sophomores. As a sophomore, you can think of your score as an early warning system for how you might perform on the real thing next year, or even into your senior year. No colleges will ever see this score. It's not recorded. It's not reported anywhere. It's just there to give you a sense of how you might score on the test when it really counts, either in 11th or 12th grade. Unless you take what's called the NMSQT, the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test, as a sophomore, the test will have no bearing on National Merit Semifinalist or Finalist Awards. The NMSQT version is normally given in your junior year, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes when we talk about juniors. If you scored well on the PSAT as a sophomore, that's a good sign. It means that you will likely score as well or better next year as a junior or a senior. Of course, there are no guarantees. And the worst thing you can do with a strong score on the PSAT in 10th grade is to get lazy and assume that you'll automatically replicate this score or maybe do better without really doing anything. You might or you might not. Maybe the high score that you got this year as a sophomore was a fluke. So don't let your score make you complacent. Now, if you didn't score as well as you had hoped, it's not necessarily a bad sign yet, but it does put you on notice that you have some work to do, maybe even a lot of work, depending on where your aspirations are. And it may give you pause if you've been assuming the last few years that you are Harvard bound, because SAT and ACT scores play a big role at highly selective schools like that. Now, it wouldn't mean that you should give up on such schools, but it may be a sobering signal of how much work you have to put in to even be in the ballpark of a school like that. And before we move on, I want to clarify something. Let's say you get a 1200 on the PSAT as a sophomore. This does not mean that you will automatically get, say, a 1400 on the real SAT in a year or two, just because you're 2 years older and probably smarter by then. In other words, the sophomore PSAT is not the same test as juniors and seniors would take. You're taking a sophomore version of the test. It's calibrated for sophomores to give you an idea of how you would do if you were a senior right now. So don't just start adding points on, assuming that you'll be smarter than you are now as a senior. You might be, but the test will be more difficult by then. Here's a question worth exploring. How did you come up with your measure for what is a good or a bad score? You look down, you get a score. How do you know whether it's good or bad? Is a 1200 good? Is a 1200 bad? Are you basing how good or bad that score is by what you assumed you would get, what your brother or sister got, or what your smart friend got, or what you got on a practice test, or what's required to get into the college of your dreams? How did you figure it out? Presumably, you didn't study for this test. So what frame of reference are you using for whether your score is good or bad? Now, of course, it depends. It really comes down to where you want to compete down the road. If you want to compete at the Yales and the Harvards and the Princetons, a 1200 is not great news, because in most cases, you'll need to be deep into the 1500s to be competitive. And that's very difficult to do, to jump from the 1200s to the mid 1500s. It would mean that you have a lot of work to do. And in reality, it might mean that it's a bridge too far for you, depending on your willingness to study for the next 18 months. The silver lining is that by knowing this fact now in your sophomore year, you can start making some tough decisions. Is it realistic to pin your hopes and dreams on Harvard or Princeton? Or should you readjust your target schools? This, of course, is going to be up to you and what else you have going for you. But at least you now have a data point. On the other hand, if you got a 1450 on the PSAT as a sophomore, then you're within striking distance of schools like that. With studying and preparation, you could be in the conversation for the Yales and the Princetons of the world. Because chances are you can bump that score into the 1500s if you work hard at it. You're pretty close. Does that mean you're going to get into those schools? Of course not. Thousands of students with perfect SATs get denied every single year from these schools. But at least you're in the ballpark. At least you're in the conversation. Once again, I recommend that you use your sophomore PSAT score as a signal to start thinking about where you might fit into the admissions process. If you're below 1,000, for example, that puts you in a certain category. If you're in the 1100s to 1300s, that's another category. If you're 1400s or more, you're in yet another category. Again, I don't want to make it seem like this determines your destiny per se, but it definitely gives you an early glimpse at where you're probably going to end up. Let's move on to junior year PSAT. If you took the PSAT/NMSQT in October, then your score actually might be consequential because it's tied to the National Merit Scholarship Program. I'm not going to go into great detail on the National Merit Awards here, but I will say that it's very competitive and therefore prestigious if you hit that screen, especially in a state like California, because in this competition, you're going against your peers within your state. So the bigger and the smarter the state, the tougher it will be to get a competitive score. And just for context, I'm in California, and one of my sons got one question wrong on the PSAT, and the other one got two questions wrong. One was a National Merit finalist, and the other was a semifinalist. So that shows you how little room for error there is. If you got more than two wrong, you're probably not going to be a semifinalist or a finalist in the state of California, maybe honorable mention. So depending on the state that you're in, these are pretty tough awards to get. Being a National Merit semifinalist or finalist is extremely impressive and often comes with a monetary scholarship down the road. Getting one of these awards is even more important now since so many schools are not considering SAT and ACT scores anymore. So if you score well on the PSAT, you can put that report in. You can say that you're a National Merit finalist or semifinalist in the awards section, and it will look super impressive. So I would not blow off the PSAT or use it strictly as a practice if you think you have a chance to perform very well. Now, just like with the sophomore PSAT, the junior PSAT is a signal for what's to come. Again, it's not a guarantee, but it gives you a good idea of how you might score on the real thing down the road. Unfortunately, as a junior, you don't have as much time to improve your score if you're not happy with your results. If you got your PSAT score this month in December, that only gives you a few months in the middle of junior year to get your act together and start preparing if you haven't done so yet. Now, it's better than nothing, but it's going to be hard to find the time. The good news is that if you did zero preparation for the PSAT, then maybe there is room for improvement, maybe even a lot of improvement. That is, of course, assuming you commit to some kind of a study plan. So how much do you think you might improve your score? Well, as you might guess, it varies by a lot of different factors. Number one, how much had you prepared prior to the PSAT? Did you prepare a lot or did you take it cold? How committed are you to preparing for the real thing going forward? If you are committed, how much time do you have to devote to prepare for the real thing? And how do you plan on preparing? Are you going to get a book out of the library? Are you going to go through Khan Academy? Are you going to hire a one-on-one tutor? Obviously, the harder you work, the better the results typically. And you will have to make that decision now. Your SAT score will not improve on its own. And lastly, are you even sure that you want to take the SAT? What about the ACT? I don't want to go into details here about how to make the decision between the SAT and the ACT. There's a pretty comprehensive process that I recommend to all of my PrepWellers. I cover this in great detail in episodes 72, 80, 92, 95, 96. So please go back and review these episodes because they have some very critical information on whether you should be taking the SAT anyway. So what's the bottom line? The PSAT gives you a score that you can use to gauge what types of colleges you should be considering. Obviously, this method works better at the extremes. If you get a 950 on the SAT or a 1590 on the SAT, you're going to have a pretty good idea on how competitive you'll be when it comes to standardized testing. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it's a pretty good start. Now, if you're somewhere in the middle, like a 1200, 1300, 1400, then it's going to be more difficult than it would be on the extremes. You'll have to decide, do I want to materially improve my score to move myself into a different tier of schools? If the answer is yes, then get a plan together and get to work, like right now. If you're happy with where you are, then set your sights on schools where you're in the middle to the top quartile of SAT scores. And depending on the rest of your profile, your prospects will go up and down accordingly. Now, I know this was down and dirty with a lot of generalizing, but it's an important starting point. It's an inflection point that should get your attention, especially if your PSAT score is not matching up with what you were expecting. Because now you have the evidence to prove to yourself that you better get your act together if you plan on improving your score in any material way. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the continued support. If you know a parent with an 8th grader, 9th grader, 10th grader, 11th grader in high school that might find this helpful, please share the episode with them. You can do that by finding that small box with the tiny arrow pointing up. That's the share button. Click that button, text your friends the link to this episode, pull a little note in there from you recommending that they give it a listen. Of course, if you have questions, comments, or an idea for an upcoming episode, please reach out to me by email, DM me on Instagram, PrepWell_Academy. Check out our blog, Facebook, connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you. Until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by PrepWell Academy. PrepWell Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday, in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to PrepWellAcademy.com and enroll your child today.